in the parrot room, we're going to go after Judith Butler more. That's some promise for people to tune in.
I may not have that much more to go after her on, but yeah.
Well, I'm just promising something for the parrot room.
The most orthodox of all Marxist economists I have ever met.
The reason why I'm still a Marxist is that I claim that this structure of belief, of displaced belief, you find it in what Marx described as commodity fetishism.
That all really dialectical and intelligent human beings will have a sense for evil and some sympathy for the devil, or they will be just a little stifled and bored. I think that's not wrong. Just a little sympathy for the devil won't hurt.
Inside Critical Theory brings you this Diet Soap interview. I've got Chris Catrone with me today, a popular guest on the Diet Soap channel. You were popular when you were on the Zero Books channel. And I'm glad to have you back. You are on because last week I interviewed Conrad Hamilton about a manifesto he had written, trying to make sense of the COVID moment we're in and develop a politics around the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. And you reached out to me. I mean, often enough I reach out to you. You're, as I said, a very popular guest, but you reached out to me this time because you wanted to respond to what you saw in that interview. And you had sent me an essay, or really a lecture or speech you gave at a plenary a few years ago, and it was titled "Redeeming the 20th Century: Statism and Anarchy Today," and that's what we'll be discussing. And so Chris, welcome back to the channel.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, and tell me what it was about what Conrad said that made you think about your own assessment a few years back of the millennial left.
Well, I was struck by some things. So I had sort of predicted, not particularly, oracularly or perspicaciously,
nice
at the statist turn of the millennial left. And the DSA is a kind of an obvious example of that, but maybe even more broadly, we might even say that this is the affinity between the tankies and the DSAers, right? And of course, there are tankies in the DSA,
right.
Sort of Marxist-Leninists. And so I was struck by Conrad Hamilton's kind of frank discussion of that, like, we shouldn't vilify the state, we shouldn't be anti-statist. And he really, fell into what I thought was a predictable kind of anti-neoliberalism. That neoliberalism is, the destruction of the commons and the destruction of the public good and, dismantling of the welfare state. And, and I just thought, well, interestingly, like if you ask the avowed right, in other words, not the Democrats, but the Republicans, they will point out that the welfare state is still as strong as ever. And, entitlements have only grown. Right. And the public sector and the share of the government spending in the GDP has only grown in the last 50 years, which is true. And, and certainly others, not necessarily the Republicans, could point out that it's not as if the state has really retreated, like the repressive state has not retreated. And of course, very kind of prominently, the carceral state has grown a great deal. And so, it's not as if neoliberalism has been anti-statist. And I was also thinking back in the day, my old professor, Moishe Postone, had sort of warned that discontents with neoliberalism would lead to a new statism, right? And so the idea was that maybe the history of capitalism is going to be some kind of oscillation between statist and liberal phases of capital, and that we should beware of falling into that. And so, this has been kind of on my mind for a while. And he also threw platypus in with that. In other words, that platypus because
statist.
Yeah, that we were reading Lenin, and therefore we were statist.
Well,
and it's like, well, Lenin and Conrad Hamilton, right? It's like, so he's like, no, we should not adopt Lenin's attitude towards the state, right?
Right.
And so but again, Moish's perspective is that willy-nilly Lenin was a statist, even though he didn't intend to be, because he was sort of conditioned by history, and the liberal era of capitalism came to an end and was replaced by the primacy of politics in the 20th century, the kind of statist turn. And, that you see with like fascism and welfare statism and Stalinism. And neoliberalism comes out of the crisis of that statism. But now the crisis of neoliberalism might give rise to a kind of new statism.
Well, I want to point out something you just said you said two things that seem to be kind of at odds with each other. On the one hand, neoliberalism is not a project that backs away from the state, nor even does it undo social welfare programs. So that's on the one hand, you said that. On the other hand, you said Moïse Pastone, in a way that's indicated that you might agree with him. Moïse Pastone worried that capitalist development would fluctuate between statism and neoliberalism or liberalism. And the statism in neoliberalism seems to be missing from that dichotomy. What was he really talking about when he talked about that fluctuation between
I think he was
different
talking
forms
about freedom,
of statism,
like ideology and freedom. In other words, that freedom would appear differently in different phases of capital. That freedom in the late liberal era of capitalism might have looked like statism or the primacy of politics. So in the early 20th century, all these movements, whether it's progressivism or whether it's socialism of that time, Second International Socialism or Stalinism later, or fascism, that they're all done in the name of freedom. In other words, they're all done in the name of human self-determination, which unfreedom looks like liberal chaos, right? And the chaos of the marketplace that denies the human good, right? And then we could define the human good in whatever ways, but then it looks like the way to rectify that is to assert politics, political will, right? And that the disenchantment with that later, like 50 years later, is, oh, well, we've created this kind of monster, this kind of bureaucratic administrative state, and we've these massive corporations. And so the freedom now would be seen as restoring, the liberal civil society as opposed to the bureaucratic institutions of the state and the corporations.
Right. Okay.
Right? And then now it looks like freedom is going to be freedom from neoliberalism and the orthodoxy of the market.
Back again from the beginning. But the thing about that is, though, that under neoliberalism, the idea that we were returning to a kind of freedom from state intrusion or state control of the market was misguided. It was basically a lie, because the neoliberal project was about propping up, along nationalist lines, various corporate entities. And through monetary policy and direct subsidy, that's what neoliberalism was. And deregulation was a part of that, but it was not. It was not deregulation in total. It was just certain kinds of deregulation.
Selective.
Yeah. So, and now, I think maybe on a political level, and certainly like on an international level, the difference between the statism of the welfare state or social democracy and the statism of neoliberalism might mean the difference between a world in which, except for unequal battles between developed nations and the periphery, war is no longer on the table in order to settle international disputes between major economic powers. That the integration of global capital and the dream of like the character and network is like the neoliberal dream, where everything is settled through dollars and financialization, and there are no nations. There's just major corporations. That's the neoliberal moment. And then turning away from that means now we're turning back to the nation, and the danger of like warfare of another world war even looms in our imagination.
There was an activist, so who comes to mind immediately is an activist in Chicago who was around the Marxist humanists, but not around the Andrew Kleinman MHI,
the other ones, IMHO or
it
News and
was
Letters.
Around the International Marxist Humanist Organization, in my humble opinion organization,
right,
of Peter Hudis and Kevin Anderson and others, who himself is a red diaper baby, a son of a Socialist Workers Party U.S. Trotskyist or post-Trotskyist cadre member, longtime member. And, he's like a bus driver unionist here in Chicago. And he gave a talk about how Bernie Sanders represented the coming war, right? That Bernie Sanders' social democracy meant like the coming of World War III. And this was kind of around the time of Trump too, right? But he would have seen Bernie Sanders and Trump as nationalists, right? And this social democratic turn as nationalistic, and that would lead inevitably to war.
Yeah, I mean the parallel, the integration of the different forms of social democracy was even more apparent in France around that time. I forget the name of the social democratic far left candidate in France, but there was a candidate running who was even more overtly nationalist and nativist.
Is it Jean-Luc Mélenchon?
Yes, yeah.
Right. Well, he's nationalist in a particular way. I mean, he's an interesting figure. He's calling for a sixth republic in France, like a fundamental constitutional change. I don't know exactly where he stands on the EU. I think he's discontented with the EU. Like he has that old leftist skepticism towards the EU, which is warranted. Yeah, I mean, he's an old socialist. I don't know what his deep background is, but he seems like a kind of a post-socialist. He seems like the Podemos people, like a kind of a post-socialist character. And definitely a kind of democratic Republican kind of character, like he wants to restore, the Democratic Republic in France. And, that makes sense insofar as the right-wing party in France, of which Macron is a representative, is a Gaullist party, right? It represents that old, Fifth Republic and Fourth Republic stuff. Which there are problems, right? But the nationalism, I'm just not sure that nationalism is the big danger, right? I mean, you can sort of say that, you could say, okay, it's going to be like protectionism and whatnot.
Was Postone worried about that? When he worried about that oscillation, was he thinking about nationalism?
He was. And of course he was thinking about it in terms of anti-Semitism. And, that any nationalism is inherently anti-Semitic. And he was also thinking that the critique of capitalism is objectively anti-Semitic, right? Which is to say that the vilification of the market and of finance is objectively anti-Semitic.
Okay, but that's not the critique of capitalism, right?
It is not, right? But the ostensible critique of capitalism, right?
Right.
In other words, the kind of commonplace discontents with capitalism has a kind of anti-Semitic bent to it.
Right.
And, and that anti-neoliberalism was also going to be, in that sense, anti-Semitic. And I think, you could say that. I'm not sure if that's like a particularly salient point. I don't know that that's like the big danger. I mean, he saw it in terms of like anti-Zionism is the anti-imperialism of fools, right? And in the same way that anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools, So he's but it's the socialism of fools. It's the anti-imperialism of fools, meaning that it's not that Postone was against socialism or against anti-imperialism, but he was against the foolish part. Right. The foolish expression of it. So he was very concerned that like real discontents with capitalism would take on a conservative reactionary character. And of course, he thinks that the precedent for that is the political turn of the early 20th century, the primacy of the political. I think in the last public speech he gave before he died, which was in Vienna, I think in late 2018, he said something like, "We saw what happened when the old petty bourgeoisie was destroyed. It gave rise to fascism. Now we're dealing with the destruction of the working class. What monstrosity, what atrocity is that going to give rise to?"
I can't
And
see.
I just feel like, no,
That's not true. That's just not
there's no
true.
destruction of the working class.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
I
In
mean,
the same way.
when I interviewed Poisson, he claimed that the working class might not be the revolutionary subject because it was never going to become large enough and politically aware enough to take on the task. But that to say that is not the same thing as to say that the working class as an economic category, maybe not as political force.
I mean, Poisson was basically saying that Trump is the working class candidate, and you could say that he was, right?
Yeah, I guess.
In some empirical sense. I mean, he's not the proletarian candidate, and he's not the socialist candidate by any means, but he was, I suppose. Did
he have more working class votes? Really? I think the Democrats still had more working class votes overall. He just had an increase in working class support from other Republican. Increase. Yeah, but not.
And
but it wasn't
it suggested
more.
Further inroads.
Okay.
Right, and so when you're looking at that, you're looking at. It's also how you define class. So there are a couple of ways you could come at it. One is the unions endorse Hillary, but the members vote for Trump. That happened.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously that's a huge turnout machine for the Democrats. And so losing the members of the union to the other candidate, that's like a big deal.
But still more union members voted for Hillary than for Trump.
It's probably. But but again, then it's like, well, how do unions represent the working class? So the other question is, how are we defining class? And, in a broader sense, this is what gives rise to all this stuff about the PMC. And is the PMC part of the working class or not? And also the educated versus the uneducated. The way that mainstream capitalist politics defines class is educated versus uneducated. So if you're educated, you're middle class. If you're uneducated, you're working class.
Yeah.
And which is a very strange way of putting it. But I feel like all the PMC talk fits into that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? That angst about what is the class status of the PMC. So, you mentioned, this presentation that I gave back in 2019.
Yeah, let's get to that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Which was on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a kind of an internal platypus discussion to a certain extent, where the issue there was the 20th century and Stalinism, right, as the salient phenomenon of the 20th century, and what to do with it and what to do about it. And so it's basically an argument between me and Richard Rubin about the significance of 1989. And Richard, his attitude is 1989 changed everything. And my attitude is it kind of changed nothing. So I think that the new left and neoliberal turn of the 70s is more important than the fall of Stalinism from power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I think that the crisis of Keynesian Fordism, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Soviet Union, mm-hmm. right? In other words, the debt crisis of the Eastern European countries really undid Stalinism. That's why you had the rise of Solidarność in Poland, and that's why you had the breakup of Yugoslavia. These countries do go into serious economic crisis, like the rest of the developing world in the 70s, mm-hmm. where their debt suddenly changes, mm-hmm. right? So they go from sustainable debt to completely unsustainable debt. And, what brought Solidarność to power was the demand that the IMF made to Poland, which is that they had to get any more money, they had to let Solidarność run in an election, mm-hmm. right? It's very straightforward. So I think that that's more significant than the belated effect of all of that, which was the destruction of the Warsaw Pact. Right, so that's where the discussion comes in. And it's kind of okay, well, so when we're talking about the 20th century, we're basically talking about what Eric Hobsbawm called the short 20th century, 1914 to 1991. Mm-hmm. From crisis of World War I leading to the Russian Revolution up to the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And, by the way, that's the weakest of all of Hobsbawm's volumes
Mm-hmm.
of his history, precisely because of his Stalinism and the way he has to deal with the 20th century. I, rather provocatively, I just feel like forget the 20th century, meaning the 20th century is just a house of horrors. And, I was reading about, for some reason, the Church Committee came up, the investigation of the CIA and MK Ultra. And, this kind of stuff, right? And so you'd like to say, okay, well, probably the same thing is going on now as back in the 50s and 60s with MK Ultra. Probably all sorts of secret atrocities are being committed, but maybe not, actually, right? So it's quite possible the mid 20th century that people now look back upon fondly, the welfare state and all this stuff, was actually a horror show in a way that the present is a different horror show, but it's not the horror show of the state that can snatch citizens off the street to conduct experiments on.
Right.
Like that. Maybe it's not quite like that. Right. It's a different kind of problem.
I mean, the MK Ultra thing mostly took place through mental hospitals and the institutionalized. I think. When you talk about brainwashing,
people who were kind of temporarily, like there was a woman who was hospitalized briefly for postpartum depression.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
I know, but I mean, they weren't just snatched off the street. But yeah, I understand what you're saying.
More or less.
Yeah,
I mean? And they also did snatch people off the street, not in the United States, but And
well, I want to reframe this a little bit because I think that I made the mistake of sort of going into the weeds on some issues.
No, this is going into the weeds, but let me recover.
Let me just see if I can reframe it with a question. So the point here, when it comes to the difference, how to interpret the 20th century, is to think about the way in which a certain kind of statism dominated the 20th century, and how that domination by the state, whether it became neoliberal later or not, defined the failure of the socialist project.
Right. And I don't think it did.
You don't think it did? Okay.
No. In other words, well, first of all, what socialist project?
Well, let's say Stalinism and social democracy.
Actually existing socialism.
Right. That was a symptom of the failure of the struggle for socialism that came out of the 19th century and had already been defeated by your estimation in 1919.
Yes.
Okay. Right. So what you're saying, the reason we can forget about the 20th century is that everything that's gone on since 1919
is the counter-revolution.
Is defined by a statist counter-revolution.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So I just want to get that clear.
Good. No, that's good. And of course, neoliberalism is just part of that. It's a continuation of that. It's not a reversal of that. Right. It's actually in some ways a more pernicious form of that. Because, there are different ways of thinking about neoliberalism. One, though, would be that it's just as statist as before, but less responsibly so. In other words, that the state is just as much, and maybe more so, a presence. I think Ted Cruz actually said this in the Senate not that long ago about the growth of the state since the 70s, in the last 50 years. Right. And, but in an unaccountable way.
Or accountable to different people.
Accountable to different people, but politically unaccountable. In other words, in the democratic sense. So if we're living through a crisis of democracy now, because, by the way, that's where I put Conrad Hamilton's whole discourse. I'd put it into a kind of restoration of democracy, that's what he's calling for. And, that is understandable, but what it really poses the question of is what democracy? Meaning, okay, was the United States more democratic in the 60s than it is today? Right? And what would it mean to claim that was so? And this is, of course, the sort of Jacobin DSA underlying assumption. It's the Ralph Milibandism. There is this kind of idea that in the 20th century, democracy grew. So socialism didn't necessarily grow, but democracy did. Right,
and they'll point to the documents that came out, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s about the crisis of democracy, where there's too much democracy, and the trilateral commission.
The right furnishes all sorts of proof that there was an anti-democratic turn in the 70s, that there was a kind of deliberate, a Samuel Huntington. Yeah, I mean, there's there are these characters who are coming in and saying, oh, if you want to avoid the kind of crisis of legitimacy we have now, we should really tamp down this democracy stuff because it's getting unwieldy. It's getting unmanageable. And I kind of feel like, well, what you're really talking about is the terms of Bonapartism, to use an old Marxist term.
Explain what that is again.
Well, it's the idea that the state has to solve problems for society, or try to. In other words, that the old kind of bourgeois liberal democratic ideal of the American and French revolutions, for example, but also, the Lockean Glorious Revolution, the kind of the English, tradition that is traced back to the Magna Carta, but really is about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. It's really about the bourgeois era. It's not some kind of tribal Anglo-Saxon democracy or something. That Bonapartism is really an 1848 phenomenon, although there are rumblings like leading up to that, where, the way Marx put it is the bourgeoisie can no longer rule in the old way and the proletariat cannot yet rule. So the whole question is, how did the bourgeoisie rule in the old way? And did they rule through civil society or did they rule through the state? And the argument was, the old Marxist argument, which everyone has disputed, but I stick to, is that actually the bourgeoisie ruled through civil society, not through the state. In other words, that the state was subordinated to society, did have to answer to society, that the state didn't really rule. And when that happened, like in the mid-19th century, when the state did sort of take over with Louis Bonaparte, so it's not Napoleon Bonaparte, it's Louis Bonaparte, that was an expression of the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism. And for Marx, it was like a negative indication of the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, that just as the bourgeoisie could no longer rule through civil society because of the crisis of capitalism, bringing forth Bonapartism, of the capitalist state per se, to rule in the name of the bourgeoisie in a way that the bourgeoisie can no longer do civilly and socially, spontaneously, but has to be done politically through the state, that's the same necessity that the dictatorship of the proletariat would meet. In other words, that the dictatorship of the proletariat would do what the Bonapartist capitalist state has to do, but with the goal of overcoming capitalism, A, and B, with the dictatorship of the proletariat being based on, a broader democratic basis, both politically and civilly and socially, because it would be based on all the, labor unions and other like social organizations of the proletariat, that objectively this would necessitate overcoming capitalism. In other words, that objectively the problem of capitalism, problem of capital accumulation and the reproduction of society would be posed in a way that in capitalism, that appears to be some like force of nature outside of the scope of politics. Right? So the state can only kind of go from one crisis to another and kind of manage the crisis, but it can't actually grasp the crisis, the actual crisis of society and capitalism, in a way that the dictatorship of the proletariat would be objectively compelled to do.
Would you say, this is something that just came to me while you were describing this to me, would you say that you can think of the rise of the Bonapartist state as the way in which capital, the accumulated capital, the power of capital, dominated the bourgeoisie?
Yes.
Okay.
It's an expression of that. It's a mediated expression of that, but it is an expression of that. And of course, it's not like an actual solution. In other words, Bonapartism is not a solution. It's just a crystallization of the crisis manifest.
Right. And so the fact that the bourgeoisie could not escape from capital is why the state had so much power and continues to have so much power. And the proletariat could be more bourgeois in a sense than the bourgeoisie. They could be more humanistic. They could be better at achieving equality, more democratic, and
more socially minded.
more socially minded, and more powerful, more
powerful, yeah.
Truly the masters of the universe, because they could overcome the mediated force that seems like a natural force in society.
Or they could at least grasp it as a problem, because again, the idea is that I think that the way Marx and Engels put it is that the democratic republic, which would be achieved by the dictatorship of the proletariat, would be the political form in which the class struggle would be fought to its conclusion and capitalism would be overcome. It's a very opaque formulation, because they have this idea, which was sort of intuited by Maoism in the 20th century, which is that there'll still be capitalism after the capitalists are gone. Right.
And this comes to our kind of ongoing debate about the critique of the Gotha program and how to interpret what he's saying there, and the idea of transition. We could get to that, but I wanted to point out, I watched a Platypus Affiliated Society panel recently, and I forget what the topic was, but it was about what is class.
Class and the left. It was a good panel. I thought it was good. It was
really good. And there was a member of the DSA.
Yeah.
Who was
the Class Unity faction.
Class Unity faction, who I thought was fascinating and really worth listening to. And it was strange to me where he ended up.
Yeah, no, I mean, but yeah, it's indeed the case. I mean, the other people, Elena Langa and Carlos, I forget his last name, the Midwestern Marx Collective, they were... I felt more sympathetic to them than to the Class Unity guy, ultimately. But they were all kind of, raising interesting points. But he was, trying to square the circle between
the Class Unity guy, right, was really trying to apply a the critique of political economy from Marx to our political situation, try to get beyond the political impasse of the left. And where he ended up was, we should all go into business. Right? We should all become innovators in the realm of business and create new forms of social reproduction on that level of, like, a level of factory, a level of enterprise.
Oh yeah. So it was a little bit Richard Wolff-ish or something.
Well, it wasn't clear to me. It was a little Michael Albertish, maybe a little, but not even as clearly as that, because you could easily enough see how it would shift from a class project to overcome capitalism into, like, Silicon Valley disruptor economy. Let's focus.
I mean, look, this would be my basic point.
Yeah.
Which I think I brought up on the This Is Revolution interview I did recently, which is that the petty bourgeoisie and intellectuals, insofar as intellectuals are, they might have to, like, earn a wage and might be part of the proletarianized working class, but in terms of, like, their role is kind of petty bourgeois necessarily. That intellectuals, can cook up all sorts of socialist schemes, but really they're just going to be pointing to the innovation of capitalism. They're not going to be, in other words, the intellectuals are not going to bring us socialism. Only the proletariat can, right?
Right. But I thought the way he failed was really interesting, and more interesting than maybe the other panelists, but I didn't pay attention. I started in the middle. I came in after it started and I left, But no,
the other panelists might have seemed too, I don't know, doctrinaire or something, less practical. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, but he was
too.
I liked him because he was using the critique of political economy. But the reason I bring it up is because this problem of how to relate to capital and whether or not, because the only way for you to have a dictatorship of the proletariat is through the state. Through the accumulation, the grabbing state power.
In the Marxist view, yes.
In the Marxist view. So, okay, once you accept that, then differentiating between the kind of statism that dominated the 20th century and the actual socialist project that you say occurred up until 1919 becomes a little trickier for people to understand.
Let's deal with the claim. So the claim of communist China today is that it's the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that they're taking a capitalist road of development to socialism.
Which is what Lenin did.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, you could say that Stalin fudged the issue by declaring the Soviet Union to be socialist in the 1930s, but that later Khrushchev and Brezhnev, that their attitude is, well, we're still on a socialist road, and really this is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And, and again, it's like didn't Gorbachev start out as a tractor driver on a collective farm? I guess it is the dictatorship of the proletariat, isn't it? I mean, Mao, no, not so much, right?
Right.
But and Zhu Enlai, maybe not so much. Maybe they're old landlord.
Look, this is not the way to conceive of the proletariat, okay, where you were born.
Right.
Okay.
But let's just give it, its due, right? That it's more or less plausible that what you had in those countries were dictatorships of the proletariat. This is where I feel like, no, the point would be that dictatorship of the proletariat is pitched at a global level, which doesn't mean every single country, but it does mean that the proletariat is able to politically affect the predominant part of the reproduction of global capital.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Soviet Union and Communist China were never in the position to do that, right? And I guess you could say, and this is why you do have some Marxists who are basically like China, right?
Oh yeah, it's happening more and more.
What's happening more and more? Because, when China becomes the largest GDP country relative to the US, then supposedly, right, this is the inauguration of the global dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't think so. I don't, because it's still going to be a minority share.
My attitude is if China becomes a greater, produces more of the GDP, the biggest nation, the most successful nation in the world, then that means that the task of the working class in China will be to start a revolution.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I think that that's true too, but I also think that the U.S. isn't going away, right?
Yeah.
In other words, I think that the U.S. was the largest global economy before World War I. It already was, and yet Britain still ruled the capitalist world, and with France as a kind of a sidekick and Russia as a kind of an adjunct added later, and really Germany kind of being the one that wanted to change the political order. But even you could say Germany and certainly the United States were kind of subordinate junior partners to British capital. And so, the global hegemon doesn't disappear by virtue of GDP statistics, right?
No.
It's a matter of politics, geopolitics. And that's where I just feel like actually China does not want the role that the US has had. Right? And, it doesn't want to take that responsibility really. It might be forced to, who knows, right? But it doesn't really want it any more than the U.S. wanted it from Britain. The U.S. didn't really want it either, right? That's the whole controversy over the League of Nations. Why did the Republicans reject the League of Nations by Woodrow Wilson? Not because they were conservative reactionary nationalists. It's because they were the liberals. They were like, no, we shouldn't be telling the world what to do. Right? We shouldn't be imposing this peace on the world.
Right.
So, again, it's, the relationship between economics and politics is, of course, quite difficult. It is a mediated relationship. It's not a direct, determinative issue. And, we'll see. I do think
up until the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat,
right.
It's very complicated because it's mediated. But the idea is that the proletariat will become the new mediating force, will be able to have the political will to transform the economic realm.
And it will be the beginning of the problem, not the end. It will be posing the problem, not solving it. The problem of capitalism. Because now we think that capitalism is this and that. We think that capitalism is the market. We think that it's Wall Street. It's finance. It's whatever. And really, capitalism, is opaque.
I think capitalism is the class relationship around production, the creation of abstract value through exploitation of labor.
But isn't it the accumulation of capital and not?
It's both. Yeah,
if it's the relationship between production at the level of employer and employee, then in some ways that predates the Industrial Revolution. No,
it's not right. No, it's the way in which that relationship has defined all production and the commodification of
I would
relations.
say no.
No. Okay.
No. Why? Because it's only when the employer is subject to the capital accumulation imperative that you have capitalism. In other words, it doesn't come from class. Class comes from it. Meaning, what is a capitalist? Is a capitalist a boss? Is a capitalist a proprietor? No, they're a servant of capital.
Right.
And
No, that's
they're
right.
successful when they are, and they're unsuccessful when they're not.
Right, but okay, right. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, right? And fundamentally, I didn't express it properly the first time around. But the point is that it's not entirely opaque, because through reading Capital and other reading Postone, reading Michael Roberts today, we can get a sense. We can follow how the mechanism.
So let's go to the
functioning.
state.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the state. What makes the state the capitalist state? Is the capitalist state a capitalist state because the capitalist class of investors has subordinated politics to its rule? Or is it because the state is dedicated to the accumulation of capital?
It's the second thing.
The second, that's right.
Right. And in China, this is why China is still capitalist. You can go in and nationalize.
Yep.
And get rid of some of the capitalist class and still be in the service of capital accumulation in China. And
but
sometimes it's better to nationalize.
The dictatorship of the proletariat would still be that too. And that's why I raised maybe these countries are the dictatorship of the proletariat. Meaning the dictatorship of the proletariat, in order to preserve civilization, in order to preserve like the accumulated labor of the past, will have to serve the accumulation of capital. And can only kind of steer it.
I mean, are you sure? I mean, I understand that in peasant countries where the productive forces weren't that advanced, that there would be a need to not only like.
But that's primitive accumulation.
Well, no, it was
accumulation. Right. In other words, accumulation is not just the destruction of the commons. It's not just primitive accumulation. Accumulation is an ongoing thing.
Right, but we have the potential now to use the general
transcend
intellect.
To transcend it. Right. But we can't just abolish it.
Right.
Because that's the anarchism.
Yeah.
The anarchism.
Well, that's where I come from, I come out of
anarchism, no, because we still need capital. Like, we need capital. We need the nuclear power plants to keep running. We need, like, the oil to still be on the ships on the ocean. We need capital.
Yeah. But what we need but those are that's useful wealth that you're talking about, and the abstraction.
It's still mediated. It will still be mediated by labor. In other words, this is the transition. I mean, really, what's most controversial about Marxism is that it says we can have socialism instantaneously. Right. So Marx has this wonderful critique of what's wrong with capitalism, but then politically he says we can't overcome it instantaneously, and then people are like, oh. Why not? What do you mean? Oh, you want to put the Marxists in charge, right? So Bakunin said, Marx and Engels, they're just going to be the dictators of the proletariat. They're not going to be.
So how do I distinguish between China and what I consider to be actual dictatorship of the proletariat? Where would the difference be?
China is not steering the world towards socialism in any appreciable sense, meaning. It is, this is again why the Maoists have a kernel of truth to them, the capitalist roaders versus the socialist roaders, and why the Maoists say that China is like social imperialist and capitalist. Like they like denounce China, like the Maoists super denounce China after the purge of the Gang of Four, right? Because it's like, well, China made a decision to prioritize capital accumulation over the struggle for socialism. And so how do you determine this? Politically. In other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to be a massive global political struggle over the direction of humanity. And again, Marxism gives us the tools to understand that our choices are constrained by capital accumulation insofar as we haven't overcome that blind imperative. Right. But again, that's why I say the dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't solve the problem; it only poses it.
Look, I am halfway with you here. I mean, I am definitely for the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think I have some sort of Silicon Valley utopian.
It's not the millennium. Like, in other words, it's not like the end of history, Judgment Day. It's the beginning of history, according to Marx and Engels. It's the beginning of history. that will make what we're doing now into prehistory.
I want the working class to come along and invent new mediating factors to direct their real physical labor.
The way that I like to put it is, because I'm like, bad Chris Catrone, Leninist, blah, 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 right? I feel like the goal is to overcome Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky and Marx and Engels, right? In other words, like if the revolution continues, then Marxism is overcome. Like you don't have to think about things in this way anymore, right? And so Marxism gets you to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and after that, it's post-Marxism. So the problem being that we've tried to declare post-Marxism before we've gotten to even be able to address the problem of capitalism.
I agree with you. So, but I want to go back to your remarks, because I had a question about how we judge the 20th century. I mean, it does seem to me you've made it complicated to judge the 20th century. It's easier when you can say something like, well, as long as there's still commodity production, or as long as there's still exploitation, or as long as there's still wage labor, as long as there's still money, as long as we're not all anarchists living the dream, then capitalism persists, or as long as there's still sexism, whatever you want to say. But you talk about the 20th century as a regression,
yes,
and not progression,
yes.
And if we aren't sure about the role of the state, and if we're a little unclear about what is a dictatorship of the proletariat or not, then we still have the question, like, how do we judge the 20th century? I think, and can we say that maybe in some ways the 20th century did have moments of progress, or in sectors that had progress? Like, for instance, women were more liberated throughout the 20th century.
Were they?
They were more integrated into the working class, and they gained legal status and political power in the 20th century overall.
Which may not matter so much.
Right. But simultaneously, though, at the same time, there was regression in so much as the working class was demobilized as a political class in ways that were inconceivable.
I mean, of course, socialists always stood for the legal equality of women and for women voting. I mean, this is why it's when the SPD comes to power in Germany, that's when women get the right to vote. Right. When the Bolsheviks come to power, that's when women get the right to vote. Right? Like, it's part of the Marxist program. However, so you could look at it a couple of ways. One is a dialectic of progress and regress. Another would be straight up regression. So it's tricky because I think the dialectic of progress and regress applies to the era of capitalism. Like, that's the way the old Marxists understood capitalism, as a dialectic of progress and regress. In other words, that's one of the ways that the contradiction of capitalism is posed, is that it's both progress and regress at the same time, of freedom. Because we're not talking about like technology or something like that. Because
I'm talking about freedom, like women's liberation.
Like freedom. Then the question is, well, what kind of freedom, and freedom in what form? And obviously there are discontents with mere political emancipation. Otherwise, you wouldn't have second-wave feminism. In other words, the first-wave feminism is suffragism, essentially. And it's property rights and divorce rights and contraception rights, at a legal juridical level, voting rights, that all come together. Like, are you a full juridical subject or are you a minor? Right? All those come together. That's first-wave feminism. And then why do we need second-wave feminism? Because it turns out that's insufficient, right? And the question is whether then, after juridical emancipation, whether that's sexism anymore, right? In other words, then you're really talking about complex issues of social reproduction and the family, and how, like, the proletariat reproduces itself under capitalism. And, you get into all this stuff about, like, paid and unpaid labor and, social cooperation that's a free gift to capital, from the Grundrisse, and whether women's labor amounts to that. Like, you get into all these things. And so I would say that, I guess that's the clearest example, is that women are more equal and more free today than they were in 1919. I guess that would be the idea. I would challenge that. In other words, I would say that, giveth with one hand, taketh with the other, meaning that already what Marx had pointed out back in the 1844 manuscripts, that abolishing like patriarchy would just make women into the prostitutes of society as a whole. And, this was his analogy to wage slavery. Right? In other words, that yes, women are now free to be wage slaves. But is that really emancipation? I guess it's emancipation relative to patriarchy. But then the issue is this really patriarchy? In other words, fundamentally, is this society patriarchal? And then you're going to go down the postmodernist highway where you get into like the androcentric character of the human. Like I saw Judith Butler speaking recently with Cornel West and Simon Critchley and Glenn Greenwald about identity politics. And Judith Butler, true to form, she was like, well, the very definition of the human was sexist. I guess you could say that, right? In other words, that if we have like the bourgeois subject and the laboring subject, like woman as worker, I guess that is androcentric and I guess it is patriarchal. I guess it's based on all sorts of assumptions. She also tried to say that it's racist, as if there are racial differences that are effaced, which is an interesting thing, right? So you're really going to say that non-white people are like different kinds of humans?
Well, was she talking about the origin of the notion of humanism or of
I mean, it's Foucauldian, but she went beyond that. She went, as usual, the Foucauldians are worse than Foucault. Right. Which is that it's not just about the origins, it's about now, today, right? Because she was attacking Glenn Greenwald for being a class reductionist and trying to restore the old humanism, which is inherently racist and patriarchal and blah, blah, sexist. Yeah. And I was like, okay, go girl.
Well, I just remember when she talked about when she was interviewed by Matt McManus on the old channel, and he asked her what did she think about the rise of the social democracy, and the Bernie Sanders movement and the return of class politics, and she said she did not support it because it would would restore white men into powerful positions on the left.
On the left.
And I had a date. I just feel like, do we care? I had a date that went wrong. I have to work in my dating life to every single podcast.
Okay. No, I know what it's like.
But I brought this up to her, and I said, so what does Judith Butler want white men who are on the left to do? Stay home and sew? and she, which was not a winning thing to ask. And then she said, and I said, you know what? I'd be willing to do it if she would return to Marx and political economy and struggle for the working class.
If women are going to like lead the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat, I'm happy to stay home.
Yeah, me too.
Because who needs this shit, really?
Yeah, exactly. That's
right.
So, but the thing is, that she couldn't have really meant what she said. Because what she really meant was that, hey, I'm on the podcast. What she really meant was, I don't want the struggle for class to return.
Yeah, I know. That's really it. And that's really it. And that's where Adolf Reed is correct, that this is just the left of capitalism, left of neoliberalism. And I mean, I would just say, again, whatever happened to use your privilege?
Yeah.
Right? And, because this angst about the PMC that we were talking about earlier, about like, whether the left is PMC, maybe we are. Like maybe intellectuals are in a privileged position class-wise, but what about using that? Right?
Yeah.
Like maybe we need some more D-class A intellectuals. Maybe we need some more trust fund babies to be like, the theorists and strategists and full-time militants and organizers of the socialist movement. Fuck it. Like, why not?
Yeah, I'm with you. Listen, my kid just came home and I'm realizing he's home early. So I'm gonna end this conversation here, but we'll in the parrot room, we're gonna go after Judith Butler more. That's some promise for people to tune in.
I may not have that much more to go after her on, but yeah.
Well, I'm just promising something for the parrot room.